So hi, thank you all for coming again. My name is Ноам Хофштадтера. My current position is I am managing the public advocacy department at the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. In the past, I used to do all sorts of things, mostly in the scene of the Israeli human rights organizations, some peace organizations. I was also had shortly held some teaching position at Ben-Gurion University because I did my PhD in political science back in the days, and lately I was involved in some startup as a researcher or head of research, but mainly I'm in this line of business of the human rights. And as I said, currently I'm with PCATI. I've also written several reports with PCATI throughout the years. And PCATI itself, it has been around since 1990. When it was established, and since its establishment, it was always busy with countering torture in Israel, as the name implies. It was established during a period where it was around the first Intifada, as they call it, the uprisal, organized more or less uprisal of the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank, mostly started in Gaza. And this was a period when human rights organizations in Israel were beginning to establish professionally. The Israeli Association for Civil Rights was already there since '72, I think. But more human rights and focused organizations started then. Also B'Tselem and others. So PCATI has been around for a while now, and it has been busy mostly with torture by the most, should I say, professional state body that's in charge of torture, which is the Israeli Security Agency, or is it called Shin Bet, Shabak. GSS, its formal initials in English, General Security Service. So PCATI was mainly busy investigating and complaining and representing prisoners who were investigated by the ISA and filing complaints in their name. We never did, or I think never, did the actual representation in the criminal sense as lawyers, but rather we addressed the torture aspect and allegations, depositions, for official complaints and follow up on those complaints, and other more principal legal work and also public work as the days went by and the years went by. Actually, and there was some development in this area, also in the Israeli legislative arena and the jurist in the role of the courts, because there were two main occurrences. One was an official committee which established the fact that torture do happen in a systematic way by the ISA. And later on a verdict of the Israel Supreme Court following a petition by PCATI and other human rights organizations. The petition was filed in '94, and then the verdict came in '99. And the verdict said basically that it's not allowed to torture, which is, fairly nice, because Israel still does not, and certainly did not have, but still does not have a law against torture, even though it is signed on the Convention Against Torture. This is one of, and possibly the most primary demand of this convention. They used to outlaw torture specifically and explicitly, but Israel still fails to do so.
What year was it, the
They?
convention? What year? Year?
Yes, what
What
year?
was
The
the convention?
convention?
Yeah,
I don't recall, but it's since before what we are discussing right now. I don't recall when Israel exactly signed it. And so the court, back to the 1999 decision, the court decided and spoke out that torture are not permitted, but it left a loophole in that decision. And that loophole allowed to use enhanced methods of interrogation and said that it might be justified in retrospect if it will be found that the interrogator who used those enhanced methods actually had to use had the necessity to do so. They came up with it was related to the term ticking bombs, okay, as a metaphor, or not just a metaphor, as a sign. So if an interrogator has an urgent need or certain or some certainty that it has an urgent need to get information from a prisoner regarding a ticking bomb, so regarding an imminent threat to life that's very urgent and there's no other way to do it. So they may use enhanced interrogation methods. And then in retrospect, after this happens, they will have to justify themselves in front of the court. And then they might use the necessity defense, which is a criminal defense that's it's a criminal defense in Israeli law, not just for torture, and not just in Israeli law, okay? But it holds that if a public official had found it, or it was necessary for them to uphold certain actions, they might be defended as so. Yes, please.
Just regarding the law against torture. Regarding the law against torture in Israel, at least what I heard from Alona from your organization is, as far as I remember, is that it's like only specific types of torture they regard as enhanced, but other types of torture they're not. For example, with torture with the pose, like when you're stuck in the same pose for a long time, for long hours, there's like specific pose that you can't put them in, but you can put them in other poses. Like, is it?
Yes, so it's not exactly the law, but yes, you are rightly referring to what is maybe counted or not officially as enhanced methods. But what I would like to say, and this is exactly actually where I was getting at, is that this loophole that was left actually resulted with a very wide habit of torture and non-existent accountability. So the necessity defense, which the court put out as a possible refuge for anyone who commits torture, was never actually used because it didn't get to the point where interrogators were indicted and had to use any sort of defense. And regarding permitted or unpermitted methods, and indeed, as at PCATI, the official ways to say what is permitted or not, they have their official place, but the reality shows that interrogators, while I'm sure they are well aware of what the law says and well trained, use all kinds of methods interchangeably and as by their own protocols, needs, or whims, I'm not sure. So the fact remains that since 2001, we have like very regular data since then. At least, very least, 1,860 complaints of torture were served either through PCATI or by private lawyers or some other organizations, or sometimes observed by bodies from within the ISA and pointed out as possible cases. And of those 1,860 at least cases, five of those cases were found eligible to be criminally investigated. So 5 criminal investigations were opened and 0 indictments resulted. Okay, so 0 trials and of course no punishments. And this is the amount of accountability we got for this loophole so far. Yes, please.
It was like prosecuted in Israel. They did not go to like European.
It was never prosecuted. They were investigated by the Israeli criminal system or initiated investigation, but they never got to the point of prosecution.
So, and it only stayed in Israel. Like those cases never got out to the European court.
It's all within the Israeli system. Yeah, and that's what. Yes, this is the only system that so far touched this area.
Wow.
Okay. So the question was, what were the investigations by the state, or are they conducted also through the victims or their representatives? And the answer was it's by the state. And so we got to all that through introducing PCATI, but the topic of our conversation is actually wider and is certainly not the ISA, but rather the prisoners that were tortured. And here we get to the point where I talked a bit about the past and about the data so far since 2001. So I should say that since October 2023, October 7th, and the attack on Israel and the ensuing attacks and what resulted, the war crimes that started here and then spread very wide in Gaza by Israel. Since then, the rate of complaints about torture in the ISA doubled. Okay, keep in mind that most people, certainly most Palestinians, do not complain of violence, either out of fear or out of, there's no point usually in complaining. So these numbers are indications. They are certainly not, they are indications to the extent of the phenomenon. And this is true for every aspect almost in the relations between Palestinians and Israeli authorities, and I suspect and I think also in other cases worldwide, when there is severe oppression within, whether in a state or by a state. So, are you asking something? No? Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you said that the Palestinians don't ask for help for like, they don't complain, yes, you said complain. They don't complain because they see no reason to, because it's pointless. But is it really pointless? Because I understand that it's actually they will not get any justice, any proper result from the complaints. But are there absolutely no reasons to complain for them?
Well, I'm not a Palestinian, so I can only answer how I see it is from my own knowledge also. So when I said that there's no, that it's pointless, I didn't mean to say it is pointless in an analytical way, but from the point of view of someone who anticipates a concrete result. So statistically, and this goes throughout, not just ISA, not just in torture, but statistically throughout all the topics, Palestinian complaints by Palestinians against on violence, whether by settlers or by state authorities, are disregarded, and the amount of complaints that live to see a criminal investigation is close to zero. Indictments practically zero. So, for example, okay, in the IDF, in the Israeli army, out of really hundreds of cases of complaints and more than this, and many thousands of cases of violence since October 23, we saw only one guilty verdict, one indictment and one guilty verdict for a reserve soldier of a low rank who was found guilty in severely assaulting a few Palestinians twice while driving them from one spot to another to a military imprisonment camp. And for that, he was sentenced to 7 months in jail. And so these proportions also of the how many are indicted, how many are convicted, and what of the punishments, these proportions exist throughout all the contexts, and not just of this war. I recommend if you're interested in this aspect. There's an Israeli organization called Yesh Din, maybe you've heard of it, or maybe not, but Yesh Din, and they are investigating it. They have, annual reports of exactly this type of accountability measures. Now, whether or not it has a point analytically, or from, looking at the scene as a whole, it may have a point, like maybe because eventually there is logic to, confront the state with what it is doing also morally, but also from a practical point of view, because eventually when the world or enough states decide that this is the political timing and the pressures are just right, and maybe the principle of complementarity will step in, which means that if the state is not able and not willing to address its crimes, then there is room, for the international community to interfere. So from that point of view, for example, so these are the types of point of view that I think that there is a point, yes, to pursue justice in this way. But if I don't know what I would do if I were a Palestinian who now, has to take a risk of being beaten or my family is on the line, etc., etc., etc. And now or maybe I just don't have time for this, or maybe I don't want to remember my trauma just for nothing, and etc., etc. Okay, so different perspectives.
Yeah, I understand this point of view because it really reminds me of what Russians are going through, because I'm more familiar with the Russian context, and a lot of Russians who were faced imprisonment because of their political views. They also are subjected to torture often because it's just a norm in Russian prison. But when they complain, when they try to become public about the torture, they are always threatened that it will make things worse for them. But in reality, it seems like public speaking, at least, makes it less for the imprisoned, at least. It might not make their life much easier, and it might not make them free or bring any justice, but at least it brings some hope to save these people from simply being killed in prisons. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering about that, because Russian situation is very different from this, but it has this parallel of people who also don't believe that they will have any justice, and the state that completely disregards their rights.
Mm-hmm. So do you mean that once a complaint is served and some publicity is made, then it's a sort of protection?
Yes.
Okay,
it
so
is
I think
some chance that because they went public, because they are already watched by someone, if they are more violated, it will bring like bad public image, and these particular prisoners are watched for not being violated too much after that.
I understand. I think that thank you. Thank you for this also perspective. As I said, I invite your perspective as well and your knowledge, because, you know, I find it one of the most educating things about our work. Well, maybe we'll talk later about Turkey, but thank you. So I think that the situation is, of course, it is different, but I think it is essentially different in a way here. For the Palestinians, at least, but possibly the fact that, for example, when we visit someone in prison, then authorities know that someone has visited him, and someone with some public say. Maybe it does something, maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure, but it certainly doesn't get to the point where the public opinion is aware of it. So this is missing in our case. Possibly also because we are talking about two different societies. That, you know, it's not Israelis. When Israelis, the very rare cases, some of them we also took and complained for them. But there were very rare cases when Israelis, and particularly rare Israeli Jews, were submitted to torture or to imprisonment under, you know, similar conditions, and then you get huge public opinion. Okay, huge public opinion. But for Palestinians, and this is what I'm getting to, like to name now the proportions of where we are at. It doesn't go above the radar, above the public radar. So since 23, what we addressed as ISA habits have become much wider and spread all throughout the Israeli security forces that has to do anything with Palestinian prisoners. And this means, of course, first and foremost, the Israeli prison service and the Israeli military, aka IDF, which has become an imprisonment organization in and by itself all of a sudden. So more or less all of a sudden. I will talk about it in a minute. And also still in the ISA, okay? And the police, which is always involved, because, you know, it's in every crossroad of detention, more or less, not every, but in a lot of along the way, the police is also involved. So since 23, we've seen a surge in the number of Palestinian prisoners, and also a radical change of policy towards them. And this began before October. Okay, it began at the early stage, early 2023, soon after the current government took power at the end of 22, and Ben Gvir, what's his face, Itamar Ben Gvir was appointed so-called the Minister of National Security, and from the very beginning he declared and committed certain policies against the Palestinian prisoners that included what has came to be starvation, but it started with, you know, giving reduced food rations, much more crowded cells, and less rights. something about the time? No, we okay? Sorry. And less rights. For example, nowadays nobody imagines anymore to study, but when I first corresponded with Masha about this meeting, then I got some guiding questions. For example, what about how does a prison culture look like in Israel? And what about access to library? What about art? What about these kind of things? And when we are talking of Palestinian prisoners who are imprisoned under the guise of security, all the things vanished completely from their lives, and their living conditions started to deteriorate very, very, very fast and very harshly, as a policy, as a stated policy, not as something that we had to investigate to find out. Later on, there were things that were not told so upfront, and I will speak about them. But this was official policy, and so we saw a surge in the number of prisoners, of security prisoners, which has to do not only with the prison service, right? Somebody is arresting these people, so this was a government policy. And there was, I think, 30% surge since the government took power and until October 23, still before the war. And after that, it went like 250% up. And since June, I think, June 2024, the numbers are always between 9,000 and 11,000 Palestinians who are held at every specific moment as security prisoners. That means they were arrested as part of the conflict context, and not on just criminal charges, like stealing a car or something.
Were they arrested or just detained?
Excellent questions. Are they officially arrested? They are officially arrested and detained. But of those, let's talk about 10,000 approximately. Okay, this is also sort of the average since then. Currently, there are 9,300 or something. So of those, between 50 and 57%, it depends on which date, are detained without criminal charges, without any criminal charges. Most of those as administrative detainees from the West Bank, more than 3,000 right now, and another over 1,000 right now. But in the other part are also by an administrative order from Gaza under a different law, which calls the unlawful combatants law. And we can get into that or not, but for now, let's just say that about half of all those prisoners are detained and arrested and kept in prison without any official charges.
It's like always the same, and doesn't matter for what reason you were caught, or even without the reason, you will be treated as worse as possible.
Yeah. So firstly, I would like to make the distinction clear between the official reason and possibly what the person did or did not do. They don't always match, and this is why we usually treat people as innocent until proved guilty. And in this case, we need extra care on that. But regardless, the answer to your question is that all Palestinian prisoners held under security reasons or under this tag are treated the same and according to the practices that I described and I'm about to describe. So there's no distinction between them on that ground specifically. You could say, for example, it's quite esoteric, but like very exceptional in that sense. But for example, there is one prison facility that's called Rakefet, and it is underground. Okay, it was I think by the British, bit lightly used, last used by the British in the 40s, I think, and then closed and then reopened now with a youth celebration for the occasion, and people are held there without seeing sunlight for months and kept inside the cells and very, 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 very difficult conditions. And there, allegedly, it was said that there were there only people who took part in the atrocities of October 7th. But that too is not true. So even there, you can find people who, like we know, at least one, or just a teacher who was arrested somehow, and not in Israeli territory or something. And I should also say that many of those arrested as administrative detainees, and also others, are eventually released, without ever being charged, but went through this hell for a long, long time.
Even released as an exchange for?
Not necessarily. Not
just
necessarily.
released.
Some of them are just, after a while, yalla bye.
There's no difference also between people from Gaza and West Bank, because I remember in the beginning, at least, there was there was a difference between people from Gaza and the West Bank.
So here we actually get also to the point of the IDF as an imprisonment service and what's the deal with that. So since October, the army has picked and arrested groups and large quantities of Palestinian citizens, civilians from Gaza. And they were brought mostly into military detention camps, facilities. Now the military, on its face, like a priori, is not an imprisonment organization. So what was done is to build or to fastly come up with change the destination of some army camps and change them into large prisons or imprisonment camps, I would say. And Sde Teiman is one of them. It's a military camp that's become known for severe violence that happened inside it. But there were other military camps like that where conditions were typically worse, even just for the simple reason that they were not built for that. So prisoners were held typically in very large open cages out in the open, not in buildings, but just huge cages on the ground. So they were exposed to all types of weather, to the cold at night, to the extreme heat during the day. And they were exposed to arbitrary violence by arbitrary people, arbitrary soldiers, not just and only during their arrest, which was very typical and very almost like in every case that we document, we hear about severe violence during the arrest, and no matter what type of arrest, no matter the reason, no matter the suspicion. And but also during their stay, because you can just imagine that that there is no actual rule there. The rules do not apply because there are hardly any rules for that. It's not where such rules are normally kept, or it's not something that people are in the habit of behaving around even. So every soldier that comes in or comes out not just those who guard them, not just those who interrogate them and take them out and put them back in, but just simply anyone can do basically whatever they want, and so we get a lot of very hard, very difficult testimonies from there about severe humiliations and violence, including the one famous case, the one case that became famous, at least here, but I think also worldwide to an extent, because there was a video of a group of special force, it's called Force 101, 100, sorry, and as they are brutalizing a prisoner and sexually assaulting him, but even though the video does not is not, it's not a close-up, luckily, and it doesn't show the act itself, but the medical reports do testify about it very clearly, and also the prisoner himself. Just yesterday we heard that not only did the military attorney general, she was not only suspended for this pursuing this case, and not only fired from her position for pursuing this case, but she will be kicked out of the army entirely for pursuing this case. And this goes back to the matter of accountability that I mentioned earlier, because this was the second case. Like I mentioned one case, remember, in the army of indictment on violence and abuse of Palestinians. So this was the second case ever to be prosecuted, and this is how it ended. It ended with the Prime Minister calling it a blood. I don't. Sorry. Thank you. And with the Minister of Defense like hugging those people who are still in masks, while in masks, and a wide popular campaign that demands now justice for them, and a media campaign that's all like the critical voice of Israeli media is critical about the injustice done to the military attorney general. Now, where is the prisoner in this story? Completely vanished from the Israeli story. And so accountability, this is the story of accountability, of the Israeli accountability towards violence against Palestinians. It has been the story since before October 23. It's well documented and sadly documented, but cases like this make it even more clear. I should also mention that since October 23, more than 100, actually, probably about 104 identified prisoners died under Israeli custody in Israel, in the IPS and IDF camps, imprisonment camps. 6 of them while being investigated by the ISA, not during an actual investigation, but during a period of investigations by the ISA. So again, these are these parts of the iceberg that we can see, and these are the death cases, and these are this Det Iman, famous case, and but most of the iceberg is still under the water, though it's getting hot, and we see more and more of what is actually going on is exposed, gradually exposed. So we are speaking about a large population of people, of detainees. It's 10,000 in each and every moment, but it's definitely more than 16,000 8,000 overall since the beginning of the war, and I guess much more. There's a minimum number calculated by the data that we can get, that are exposed daily, that they live daily under conditions that even by themselves amount to torture, of starvation and overpopulation and lack or very serious neglect of medical care and hygiene. Scabies is coming and going, yes, large outbreaks of scabies, which is by and large something that science can handle overall, but just, you know, there's no interest in doing that. And there are also another very serious aspect of it, they are isolated from the outside world, and because they are not allowed to contact their families at all, and they are not allowed ICRC visits. Red Cross visits are also not allowed since October 23. Some prisoners we meet tell our lawyers, like you are the first person I talked to since I got arrested, and you know, it's a drama in and by itself, like this type of isolation and what it can do, and above that we get a lot of attacks and humiliations on a daily and arbitrary basis, of extreme violence and severe violence, and also, as it was exposed lately worldwide again, but a known method of sexual violence against Palestinian detainees by prison guards and by others who you know, who simply can by their duty. And this is also a very well-known phenomenon. We know of at least dozens of cases of complaints and testimonies, and very much like the other aspects that I related to, those go across imprisonment facilities. It's not just here or there or in this area of Israel. It's not just in the ISA. It's across, you know, the imprisonment bodies. It's quite throughout, and when we keep in mind that the people are mostly isolated also, so very much isolated from each other in terms of imprisonment facilities, then and we get to hear all those very similar testimonies from different places. You know, it tells us that it's very widespread, that it's a norm, basically. It's a norm.
Policy.
Huh?
A policy?
A policy, for sure, because I mean, I'm speaking about the larger phenomena now. Is there a policy of raping Palestinians specifically? I'm not sure it's written anywhere. Is it something that people know that's going on? It is. But all the other stuff that I talked about, like extreme violence without being specific, like there's also not a specific policy of, you know, a technique of how to hit the prisoner, but the policy of strong violence against Palestinians, certainly, and you know, we see the Minister of, again, so-called national security, his election not from now, since he got elected, like his new campaign. This is his campaign, this and the death penalty, going to prisons and being photographed around prisoners while they are being humiliated and tortured is the campaign. And the Israeli media, most of the Israeli media, certainly the mainstream, most of it, you know, is very submissive, like is happy to cooperate, also by framing it as, you know, okay, so yeah, let's take this picture. It's a nice picture. And this is what happened now with the flotilla, with the prisoners who came and were arrested from like 80 states in boats, right? And got detained, and they were, you know, the pictures are the same pictures, and this is essentially the same campaign, because this person, this Ben-Gvir, is photo. You can see photos of him like topping those prisoners and topping Palestinian prisoners in Rakefet, the facility, and topping like on top of prisoners, you know, when he feels like he needs more followers, or it's just the right time of the month to go to another prison and make the same photos. So it's all out there, and that's quite, you know, that's unusual. Maybe this is the unusual part. And it's also unusual about the Israeli public, I think. This is something that happened here since 23, since October. So the emotions of like the way that revenge took over, and all boundaries were lifted. And all red lines, even those that are just, you know, of shame, not even of morality, but a morality of shame, sort of like, are you ashamed or are you proud when to say that that you did something, or are you proud of what your state is doing if that's what it's doing? So all these lines were put aside. And we also see it from the very first days on how the public officials, like the government officials, their declarations and their incitement to genocide, very explicitly. You know, I don't even have to be political when I say it, because they simply incited to genocide, and they knew what they were doing. Okay, this was it was not for nothing that what's her name, Orit Struk, one of the coalition members of the of Smotrich party, I think, said that shortly after October 7th, she said these are days of miracle. These are miraculous days. And from her perspective, she knew why she said it, because this was the opportunity that allowed, you know, the violence and the revenge to spill out. And this is how we got to the point where Palestinians, where the expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank and the attacks there were, you know, got a huge boost. And the violence there was, you know, multiplied, and the radical, violent fundamentalists there that are called the hillbillies, got huge funds and were just sent out to deport as many and to overtake as much of the land as possible. And this is what allowed a policy of genocide, if we're referring to whether or not this is a policy. So, you know, to judge simply by deeds, acts, and declarations, I don't know if it's legally a policy, illegally genocide or not. We can have another discussion, but this is what they said, and this is what was being done. Okay, so, and I think this is my interpretation of this reference to days of miracle, miraculous days, because this is a chance, you know, that was very well seized. Which doesn't remove an inch from the responsibility of the Israeli society as a whole, to join in this bacchanalia of violence, which we are still experiencing.
Are there, in your kind of mind, sections of Israeli society and Israeli institutions like the House Shabak or government political parties maybe that see like this extreme violence as either immoral, right, or counterproductive, right, in some way towards Hasbara or something like that. So, and if there are, right, in your impression, could they be leveraged, right, and in which ways they can be leveraged to end this kind of widespread problem?
That's a great question. Like, if and what parts in Israeli society and also in Israeli institutions, right? If I understand your question, go against this situation of violence and whatever the reason, like morally, practically, whatever. And first of all, I know there are. You know, we are sitting in a place now that is belongs to I think the largest field movement right now in Israel that is struggling such a phenomenon. And yes, I wouldn't like to speculate too much. So I can say that, first of all, there are a lot of people who object to that. And not just the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which are, you know, there are a lot of people and they are citizens of Israel, and this is power that you know, that counts in the struggle very much. And the question is who stands in solidarity there and who stands against it, not just in solidarity. And so I want maybe to say that apart from the obvious or the regular suspects, because there is an Israeli left, and here I relate also to inside the military or inside security institutions. It is at least something I would like to believe, but it's also something that I know, you know, as an Israeli. So the war arrives. Yes, the war started, and there was this huge swing, moral, normative swing of you know, a wave of violence and terror, and you know, we can analyze it, but a wave of moral decay and practical violence. And many Israelis took part in it. Not all of them by actually doing by actually committing war crimes with their own hands. Certainly not all of them by torturing, okay? And this is our focus here. And what I'm getting is that I think that the fact that such a large part of Israeli society like went to battle, or families of people who went to battle, means to me that there are a lot of people who went through this and remained or either in dissonance or in minority within the institutions that they are serving in, okay? And this is one of the target audiences that I, for example, in my role as a public advocacy against torture, I'm referring to. Because I would like to believe, and I also really believe it, that there are a lot of people who are not completely carried away by the desire to kill or to torture, but are either complicit in silence or just afraid to come out and speak about it, or object to it in silent ways or in non-silent ways, because we see also a minority, but of demonstrations and of direct actions and of some sort of thing. And what I think is that on the one hand, there is a point in collaborating with the existing forces that do go out and fight these habits or this trend. And also in addressing the people who are somehow left in dissonance and who do not see a point in all this torture and violence, and we either go to do a reserve service because they don't see any other way for their country to survive, not necessarily in Gaza even, or they are in Gaza, but they're just in between the worlds. And I think the security establishment as such, surely there are a lot of people there. No, not a lot. There are people who do not go with the stream, but as institutions, I don't have any expectations from them by now. Certainly not the ISA, certainly not the ISA, but I wanted to say certainly not the prison service, which is, there are people everywhere who remain humane, but the prison service seems to be very, very, very swept away towards, doing whatever Ben-Gvir will say. But the army is more pluralistic in that sense because there are people from different backgrounds there. So I don't give up on that. But as institutions, I don't think that there is a way to. That's not where we can find a refuge or any potential for change. I think it must be from within those institutions. I describe a lot of ugly stuff, and certainly the circle of life or the life of prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, is quite hell. Okay, right now. I wish to point out also that the courts are very much complicit in that. Over 100 petitions were filed to the Supreme Court on different aspects of what I was referring, and nothing came through. Nothing came through. Like the Supreme Court does not help Palestinian prisoners. Never did actually, but also not in those severe situation and not with the starvation policies, not with the overcrowding policies, not with all that. No refuge there, and no accountability. So what can be done? I think there is a lot of potential, not only from within Israel, but also in the locally, as they say, like working from within and from without, and circling messages and legitimacy and illegitimacy with international crowds. This has to do with Jewish diaspora, but it also has to do with just people everywhere in the world that may, become more aware of the fact that Palestinian prisoners exist in Israel, and more so the conditions, their living conditions, and how they are kept and how they are held here. And we have been working also with international movements against the death penalty. I didn't get into that in this conversation because I was so late. But this is certainly, you know, something that we got to, and not by accident right now. This is a point in time in Israeli history where the state of Israel decided that it wants to execute people, and a lot of them, and only Palestinians. And we fought hard against this law. There are actually 2 laws and 1 military order that are about to be to make Israel a seriously executing state. And we are still fighting that, and I think that we have a chance against that because there is wide objection to the death penalty across Europe and elsewhere in the world, and across world Jewish communities and elsewhere. So the fight against death penalty is certainly high on our agenda, but also the general struggle to release, but the administrative detainees, to release people if there are trials coming to those who are suspected in committing crimes in October 7th. So releasing the rest of the detainees from Gaza as for start, and like seriously reducing their numbers, and of course fighting the day-to-day of the prisoners in prisons. And surely local and global cooperation is the way to go. And for example, us as PCATI, and I think also other human rights organizations that I'm aware of, we are not that strong in speaking in Russian, for example. Okay? It's not or Ukrainian, or we speak Hebrew, we speak Arabic, we speak English, sometimes other languages, you know, but just by chance. We don't have serious advocacy machinery in other language, and this can be a good contribution to put the word out. And we are about maybe to make some, we're planning on leveraging technology in interesting ways, maybe building some applications that now that we can vibe code, so maybe building applications that will inform perhaps soldiers of what, you know, to make them better understand what they are doing when they are committing this or other deeds, etc., etc. So, yes, please.
So, what about the treatment of the Palestinian citizens of Israel? Right? Do you see any kind of difference if they are arrested or persecuted, right, on political grounds, like for incitement or something like that? Are they treated the same, or is there a difference?
When Palestinian citizens of Israel are arrested for under a security tag, they are treated quite the same.
Yeah, under the security tag, I don't really know about the tags, right? But on political grounds.
Yes, it's quite the same. It's quite the same. Security it's really interesting because the security, what I call the tag, you know, that is how they classify them officially. This classification is done by the prison service, and I was surprised to find that out, because like when I joined PCATI, I asked around like, what's this security prisoner? What does it mean? Where does it come from? And I went and looked in the books, and it's almost an administrative classification. Of course, the Shabak and the ISA is very much involved in who is because they are involved everywhere, and this classification, you know, it determines everything for the prisoners. It's quite amazing. So when Israeli Palestinian citizens of Israel are detained under this guise, under this classification. They are treated equally badly.
Do you see any non-Palestinian?
Non-Palestinian
political prisoners kind of under that security tag, right, being treated the same way, or is it not?
There are seldom Jews, not anymore, by the way, since we have a new head of the ISA, and now, even those exceptional cases are well taken care of, but there used to be Jewish administrative detainees that were treated, not as harshly, not put together surely with Palestinians, because the blood is different after all, but I'm being cynical, so for the camera, but that's how they're treated officially, because this whole thing evolves out of a deep sense of Jewish superiority, and explicitly so. And so they are sometimes treated like denied some of their rights in a way that us and other human rights organizations are fighting against and fighting their fight. But that doesn't happen anymore. There are, by IPS data, there are people from Syria and Lebanon who are kept here, but we don't know exactly where, and we don't know exactly, this is a whole new story. But the situation, let's say, is not better than that of the Palestinians, at least not better, if not worse. Yeah.
I understand this isn't a question which is easy to answer, but I wanted to just dream a little bit. What is there any route out of this? What I mean is that what you're describing and what we all see is that in Israeli society it is torturing isn't considered immoral, which is, I'm from Russia, and it is hard to comprehend, because in Russia there is an authoritarian government. You can say it is a totalitarian government, but still, even with this government and with the war going on, etc., en masse in the public society, torture is considered immoral, which is the first step of everything. So, of course, people are tortured in prison and tortured a lot, and of course the courts are always on the side of the government, and there is all things are happening, but it is considered immoral. It isn't something that is happening in broad daylight and that is campaigned upon, as it is here. And so the question from me is there should be some route from this, because it wasn't always like that. If it went this way, it could go other way. How do you figure? How can we go there?
First of all, I agree with what you say. And I don't know exactly how to put it, but I'll try. So, is it not considered immoral? I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's not considered immoral here. I think the division between society and government is a really interesting point, I think. Like, what type of nationalism is involved, and how deep is the identification of the individual and the society with the government, and how much are they antagonized also historically, these are really different cases that it's worth a whole conversation, I think. But also going back to whether it is immoral or not, because it's elusive. It's a bit elusive, because I would think this is me, sort of speculation, but also my sense as an Israeli, that it is more about the dehumanization out of blindness and fear and hate than it is, you know, if you take a person aside from the context and show him actual violence, actual torture, make the people watch it, or you know, actually experience firsthand what it means, then, you know, maybe many of them would object it instinctively. I don't know, maybe. Certainly there are a lot of people who support it, you know, wholeheartedly support it. And some ideologically, some out of vengeance, some I don't know. But I think there are many who need some veil to be dropped from their eyes and to realize that this is actually happening in actual reality. But Palestinian prisoners, for most of Israeli Jews, are such a detached concept. You know, even from before October 23, such, you know, wow, you speak about, it's like speaking of something that is so strange to you and so not related to you, and something that is evil, you know, by definition. And so I don't know where exactly to find the hope there or how to define it in words, but I think that, as usual, yes, humanizing and giving names to deeds and making the actions, like making people realize what is actually going on, confronting with this reality, might have some positive results with some of the people. That's what I think. If that's an answer somehow, I'm not sure.
Are you doing that?
Trying. We are trying to do that, yes. We're trying. Certainly I should be trying, but I am trying. And like this is part of my role.
I have a question. Do you have some measurable KPIs for your work? For example, like you prevented 303 unlawful detention that would have happened otherwise if not your intervention or something like that?
There are two types of activities. So one is, you know, the outreach, you know, one is actual impact, right? And then there are all sorts of outputs, as they call them. So I can measure how many people saw our Facebook page, and I can measure how many people, you know, were exposed to this lecture, and all sorts of things. We are assessing and reassessing our work in light of the question, what impact are we making? Not just on society, which is always too big and too ambiguous, but also in the lives of prisoners, which is the core of our work. And as time goes by, certainly in this specific context of post-war context, not post-October, context, post-23, we are getting closer and closer to KPIs or to assessment of actually improving even small aspects of the prison, of specific prisoners' lives, or asking ourselves, you know, even how many families now know that their son is alive at all due to a war, or when we go to court, it's it's more measurable and more easy. It's easier to understand if you're doing something or not. So my answer is that yes, we are struggling to find those indications, and sometimes they are not measured by preventing overall situation of detention, because it's very, very difficult to do that.
And do you have some like normalization scale, like universal unit of torture, something like that, to like directly compare? Because you can't add unlawful detention and, for example, rape in prison like directly. Do you have some like coefficients to like to recalculate them in like universal scale?
No, we don't go that far. Yes.
Okay, but do you at least have some sense of what interventions are what interventions are more cost effective? Like you can spend like $1 million and improve in one way lives of N people or something like that.
Yes, we're trying. We're trying to assess it, and we are trying to iterate, or to we go down a specific road, a specific tactics or idea of how we can improve, actually make actual improvements in people's lives, and then you can measure it, or you can just assess it in other ways, not always a technical measurement, and decide whether to go on and pursue or not. I wish we had enough tactics and enough dollars to be in need of a very sophisticated scale, but for now we are doing it. We keep our equations with less sophisticated than what.
Blank.
Blank.
Not see.
Blind. No, I don't think it's about blindness. I think it's just not measurable.
No, we do serious efforts to assess our work. Let's put it like this. But we don't have coefficients and as sophisticated as you might describe.
Yes. So it's more technical question, I think. Since prisoners are isolated, Palestinian prisoners isolated from world, how they can call for advocacy, and do they even have any like official paper or law that can guarantee that they can call for advocacy?
In need of representation or interference, I would say, and then we can approach them, and this is and then we go to visit them on a legal capacity, and it takes a long time to set the meetings, and then to wait in the waiting hall, which is full of dead cockroaches and stuff, and then we get to see them. So there's I would say that a minority of the prisoners are being treated to some extent by lawyers. Mm-hmm. Yes, eventually, like yeah.
do you think? So we will finally, I hope, have elections in Israel, right? And I don't know, hopefully, or depends on the person, right? So the minister of the, let's say, national security will be changed. So now we know that, let's say, Itamar Ben-Gvir, so he's very like far-right activist, right? So the things he does are very like predicted, not maybe so aggressive, but still, so it's not a surprise for anybody. How do you think if the person is changed? Will it change the trend or the things or the procedures, or there is no, let's say, will to change it? As you said, that it's like it's not the new thing, like just the scale is like growing following the war after October 7th, but it was like forever. Will it change after the person responsible for it might be changed? How it's a personal question, let's say.
Yeah, certainly. Of course, I'm not sure what the answer is. I can hope it will change for the best. Also, it is indeed a change of scale, but also a change of norms that we've seen. So I don't know, because it depends, don't know how a new government, if there are elections, yes, they're supposed to be, we still don't know that there will be, but they're supposed to be elections. We still don't know, like, not just who is the persona, but, you know, what kind of government will it be, and what will it be able to see, and will it look forward indeed really on the essential sense of the word. I don't know, who knows, you know, maybe some other government who doesn't really so much care or desires to arrest so many people will just make some economic calculation to figure out, you know, the huge costs of this ideology and then change it for the better. I don't know. I would like to think that many of those inhumane policies will be reversed. I would like to think that, and that also maybe something more essential is that a lot of it relies now on special legislation and wartime legislation that is still in practice, and maybe they would like to roll that back as well. There should be improvement, but I don't know. I really don't know what to expect, like from the Bennetts of the world. I don't know. I thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Again, sorry for being so late, and thank you for staying so long.